This program is about unsolved mysteries. Whenever possible, the actual family members and police officials have participated in recreating the events. What you are about to see is not a news broadcast.
(1957). At the height of the Cold War, Army Lieutenant Paul Whipke was an observation pilot for government atomic bomb testing. Almost immediately, he began to show symptoms of radiation poisoning. Then Paul Whipke vanished and was declared a deserter. Did he get lost and perish in Death Valley, or was Paul Whipke recruited for a top-secret mission? Tanya Koprick and Richard Buckledge, two lovers, a study in contrasts. She was a promising physician dedicated to her career. He was a struggling pharmacy student with an unpredictable temper and a penchant for murder. In 1936, the Depression and the looming threat of poverty took Gary Rosman from his family. Now Gary's sister Gwen hopes you can help find her long-lost brother. Join me. Perhaps you may be able to help solve a mystery.
Tanya, here, let me help you.
In March of 1980, Dr. Tanya Koprick fell in love with Richard Buckledge. She was a practicing resident at the Truman Medical Center in Kansas City. He was a pharmacy student at the University of Missouri. It seemed an unlikely match. Richard was 10 years younger than Tanya. He had grown up in St. Louis, the quintessential all-American boy. 5 years earlier, Tanya had emigrated from Yugoslavia to study medicine, leaving behind all of her friends and family. Like many immigrants, Tanya Koprick dreamed of an America paved with gold. She was determined to overcome the tremendous obstacles of building a career and a life in a new country. At 34, she seemed to have achieved the American dream, except for one thing. Tanya longed for someone to share her life with. Enter Richard Buckledge. Richard was young and dynamic and showered Tanya with attention. Soon after they met, he moved into Tanya's apartment. 6 months later, Richard proposed and Tanya accepted. But her friends had strong misgivings about the younger man Tanya intended to marry.
I did not really like him because he using her financially and morally. She was using her for a lot of things, like using her master's charge card, and was kind of using car and using everything.
Richard spent more and more time with Tanya and less time in class. Midway through his sophomore year, he fell behind in his studies. Unbeknownst to Tanya, Richard was perilously close to flunking out of school.
He was not real motivated. He wanted it. He wanted it to be a pharmacist. But you have to want it bad enough to devote many, many hours to the academic study end of it. And I'm not sure he was willing to do that.
On July 19, 1980, university officials notified Richard that he was academically ineligible.
If you just go to the school and if you just go to talk to Dr. Sandlin, pull a few strings.
Richard demanded that Tanya use her connections in the admissions department to have him readmitted to school.
Look, you gotta help me do this.
You must help yourself.
Help myself? How am I gonna do that if I'm not in school?
I won't do it.
Come on.
I was thinking maybe he's under drugs or alcohol because his behavior was changing. He was kind of a wild person.
I can't find my electric razor.
I don't know.
Well, see if you can find it, will you?
Richard began to exhibit violent mood swings. For 3 weeks, Tanya tolerated his outbursts. Finally, on September 2nd, she broke off the engagement and ordered Richard out of her apartment. Two weeks later, Richard Buckledge returned to class as if nothing had changed. One instructor, familiar with Richard's explosive disposition, asked the assistant dean to speak with him.
Richard, I need to talk to you for a minute.
Sure.
Could we go out in the hallway? Richard, we don't show you being enrolled in this class.
Well, the admissions said it would take a few weeks for the paperwork to come
That
through.
could very well be, but that's something you'll have to take up with the admissions
Look,
board.
I know
don't-
last quarter I had a little trouble, but I'm trying now. And I have
Richard,
to
this
go back.
doesn't have anything to do with your grade.
Fine,
Nothing to
fine.
follow up. Richard, there's a proper procedure.
Richard always gave me the impression that anything that happened was not his fault. It was just that he could not cope with the fact that this was his responsibility. And again, he just, he just couldn't believe that this was happening to him.
Increasingly desperate, Richard wrote to the admissions office begging school officials to reconsider his case. On September 18th at 3 p.m., the admissions committee convened to determine Richard's fate. The decision was unanimous.
Jackie, would you please take care of that as soon as possible?
Richard's appeal was denied, and a secretary was ordered to call him with the news. Hoping to avoid a confrontation, the committee quickly dispersed. At 3:45, two professors spotted Richard driving towards the dean's office. They immediately headed in the opposite direction.
Hey, excuse me, have you seen Professor Strickland?
Buckledge roamed the hallways, searching for the dean of admissions. Under his arm, he carried a large manila folder. Some witnesses feared that it concealed a weapon.
Is the dean in?
No, he's not.
When will he be back?
I'm not sure he's coming back today.
I'll just wait for him, okay?
Okay.
Three hours later, Tanya Koprick returned to her apartment after work. By the time police and paramedics arrived, Tanya Koprick was dead. She had been shot 3 times in the head with a .45 automatic.
I came out, and then I heard the first gunshot. And I turned, and he shot her 2 more times.
There was a witness at the scene, and she saw this man walk up to the side of the doctor's car and shoot her 3 times in the face. She recognized him as being the man that dated Dr. Koprick, Richard Buckledge. Later during the investigation, we found out that Mr. Buckledge had purchased a .45 caliber handgun himself, and when we checked his residence to see if the weapon was there, we found out it was gone.
Authorities launched an immediate search for Richard Buckledge. 6 days later, Royal Canadian Mounted Police found Richard's car in Thompson, Manitoba, Canada. More than 900 miles north of Kansas City, Richard was seen by 2 area residents. He then dropped from sight.
I personally think he's back in the United States. I think he would have gotten tired of being that far north with no family, and that's not his style. His style was a little bit faster, a little flashier, a little looser, and that might have been okay for a year or 2, but I think he's back. I think he's back here somewhere.
2 months after Tanya was murdered, her parents in Yugoslavia notified police that they received an unsigned letter postmarked September 16, 1980. 2 days before the murder, The envelope was addressed in Richard Bocklich's handwriting. The letter was a vengeful diatribe which took the tone of a terrorist manifesto.
Dear Koprick family, your daughter, Tanya Koprick, has been executed in Kansas City, Missouri. She has caused so much grief, anguish, and turmoil to so many Americans that this act was necessary. Her execution was inevitable.
At the time of Tanya's murder, Richard Bocklich was 24 years old. He is 6 feet tall and weighs 170 pounds. This computer-aged photograph shows how he might look today at the age of 34. Next, the haunting story of an Army lieutenant who mysteriously vanished. His commanding officer believes he was on a secret CIA mission. August 17th, 1958, Death Valley, California. Temperature 120 degrees Fahrenheit. "42 miles from the nearest town, a fish and game warden is surprised to come across an abandoned car. The keys are still in the ignition. There is no sign of foul play. The car is registered to Lieutenant Paul Whipke of Fort Ord, California, nearly 400 miles away. The Army states that Whipke had been missing for 5 weeks and in fact has been declared a deserter. Surprisingly, Paul Whipke had always been considered a perfect soldier, and no one could understand why he would choose to desert his post.
I don't think Paul deserted. It was completely out of character for Paul to do such a thing. He was a loyal American soldier, devoted to his work. I think the Army knew exactly what happened to him. I think it was part of a big smokescreen cover-up.
The strange and unsettling account of Paul Whipke began at Pennsylvania State University, where he was an ROTC honor graduate. In 1954, after basic training, he was granted a coveted slot at Army Pilot School. In July of 1956, Whipke was posted to Fort Ord, California. 2 years later, he was assigned the duties of captain, even though he remained a first lieutenant in rank.
Paul was quite worried about his own capability, if he had the leadership ability, and if he could take care of this job or perform in a proper manner. He studied a lot, and he spent many hours at night trying to learn the job and to do a good job.
Whipke seemed to undergo a personality change. He became withdrawn and somber. He also began to suffer several upsetting physical symptoms, which may have been a result of a temporary duty assignment in the summer of 1957. Paul spent 2 months at Camp Desert Rock, Nevada, as an observation pilot for government atomic bomb tests. In that role, he was exposed to radioactive fallout. He soon noticed unusual blotches on his skin. Several months later, back at Fort Ord, he had to have all of his teeth extracted. July 10th, 1958. Late in the afternoon, Whipke left Fort Ord. He said his destination was Monterey, California, less than a mile away. Paul Whipke never returned to the base. The next morning, he was listed absent without leave. After 30 days, he was declared a deserter. The following week, his car was found in Death Valley. Army investigators traced a gasoline receipt found in the car to Mojave, California, 145 miles from Death Valley. Whipke had purchased gas there on July the 11th, the day after he left Fort Ord. The evening before, Whipke had signed the guest register at White's Motel and apparently spent the night. The next morning, he drove out of Mojave and vanished. The Army concluded that Paul Whipke had broken under the stress of his new assignment wandered off into the desert, and without food or water, perished. The Army report made no mention of Paul Whipke's physical symptoms. His body was never found, and Paul's brother Carl Whipke immediately began to investigate on his own. More than 30 years later, he is still trying to piece together the truth about his brother's disappearance. On the very morning Paul turned up missing, 2 soldiers stripped his room at Fort Ord. Everything was removed, including Paul's personal belongings.
Regulations state that the next of kin or legal representative must be notified before packing belongings, and they didn't notify us at that time. I was very suspicious of this action as soon as I discovered this had taken place.
4 weeks after Paul Whipke disappeared, a rancher driving through Death Valley saw his car. It was driven by a man in military uniform. Paul Whipke left Fort Ord wearing civilian clothes. When the car was found a week later, a pile of cigarette butts was beside it. Paul Whipke did not smoke. Also troubling to Whipke's family was the fact that the Army did not mount a search for Paul's body until 9 months after his car was found. And it was only by accident that Carl Whipke heard about the car at all.
The only way that I learned about it was due to an unofficial call to an enlisted man out at Fort Ord. In a half an hour, he called back very excited, and he said, "This is classified information," and requested that I did not tell anyone where I had received this information.
After I was informed that Paul was a deserter, I called 6th Army headquarters, and I was inquiring about his status. That I found it almost unbelievable that he would be classified as a deserter, and I was curious what was the basis for it. And I was quickly and promptly advised that, Charlie, forget this. The case has been closed, and I would recommend that you don't carry it any further. And in essence, I was told to shut up and dry up and blow away.
In 1957, Lieutenant Colonel Lewis was a captain stationed at Camp Desert Rock. He recalled the day he saw 2 men in plain clothes talking to Paul Whipke and another officer.
On the way to the airfield one morning, there was 2 visitors on the airfield over talking with Paul. I noticed that they had gone directly to the airfield instead of reporting to operations, which was required for a purpose of security. So I asked them for their identification.
Excuse me, gentlemen, did you see that sign over there?
Yes, sir.
This is a restricted area. Do you have any identification?
Yes, we do.
They showed me their military identification cards, and the picture did verify who the 2 were.
Looks okay. Is everything all right here?
Yes, sir.
Carry on.
Lewis did not note which government agency the 2 men represented, but over the next few weeks, he often saw Paul Whipke talking to the same 2 men.
When Lieutenant Whipke would come in after they had departed, you could feel and sense a rigidity in his personality traits and his mannerisms.
Whipke, is everything okay?
Everything's fine, sir.
Sure.
Sure.
Finally, I asked him, Paul, is there something that is wrong, something you need to explain? And he said, no, I'm fine. I have no problems.
Years later, Lewis realized there could have been a logical explanation for Whipke's association with the men.
During that era, there was a tremendous amount of nationwide recruiting conducted by the CIA. And with Paul's qualification, Lieutenant Whipke's qualification, he would have been an exceptional candidate for such an assignment.
January of the year he disappeared, he told me during a telephone conversation that he was going to be going on an assignment, that he was going to make a name for himself. Before he could tell me what it was, he was interrupted by some officers moving in the proximity of his desk, and he could no longer talk to me about the subject. I theorized that Paul was recruited into an Army-CIA joint program that was going on at that time. When Paul left Fort Ord, he drove to the town of Mojave, California, and checked into White's Motel. There's a possibility that he was met there by Army intelligence agents or the CIA and transported to Southeast Asia, possibly from Edwards Air Force Base, which is nearby.
Lieutenant.
Good morning, Mr. Johnson.
Good morning. Everything going all right?
Yes, sir, thank you.
Sleep okay last night?
Yes.
Carl Whipke theorized that when Paul left on his secret assignment, he turned his car over to the military, who kept it for 4 weeks before driving it into the desert.
I think the Army took his car out to the desert to get rid of it. Out of sight, out of mind. If they would just say, yes, he died on a secret assignment, we'd live with that. We're all loyal American citizens in our family, and we would buy that. Until the Army tell us what happened, there will be no peace in our family.
There is a final puzzling twist to the saga of Paul Whipke.
Charlie!
One of Paul's closest friends, Lieutenant Charlie Guess, had served with him at Camp Desert Rock and again at Fort Ord. Guess disappeared in an airplane 11 days after Paul had vanished.
How'd you feel about that one maneuver?
Just over a year later, Guess's remains were found near a crashed plane northwest of Death Valley. Curiously, the wreckage showed a different serial number from the plane Guess had taken off in. In 1982, the Army Board for Correction of Military Records met to review Paul Whipke's case and found no basis to support his status as a deserter. 2 months later, the board officially changed Whipke's status from deserter to died in the line of duty. Carl Whipke hopes that someone watching tonight served with his brother at Camp Desert Rock or Fort Ord and has knowledge that will shed light on Paul's mysterious disappearance. Next, a woman's quest to find a long-lost brother she has not seen for more than 50 years. Perhaps you can help. Catherine Bickford was 19 years old when she fell in love with Andrew Rossman, a man twice her age. It was 1932 in Lake Placid, New York, the height of the Great Depression. Rossman cut a dashing romantic figure, a rugged outdoorsman who made his living hunting and trapping in the Adirondack Mountains.
There's the spot I was telling you about.
Oh, Andrew, it's beautiful.
Catherine knew that Andrew was not the marrying kind, but she was in love, and nothing else mattered. For that time and place, Catherine and Andrew's relationship was certainly unconventional. They never married, but lived together and had 2 children, a daughter Gwen and a son Gary. Sadly, family life and responsibility proved too much for Andrew. He left Catherine when Gary was still an infant. Catherine went to work as a waitress to support her children, but was often made to feel ashamed of being an unwed mother. However, one family, the Winches, who had known Catherine from childhood, never wavered in their support.
Suffer the little children to come to me, and do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of heaven.
In the winter of 1935, Catherine had her son Gary baptized. Despite local gossip, the Winch family went to the baptism and stood by Catherine.
Amen. This is Gary Bickford, the newest member of the family of God.
By the time of Gary's baptism, Catherine was in deep financial trouble. After the ceremony, she took Florence, the Winch's daughter, aside.
What is it, Catherine? What's wrong? I got kicked out of my apartment today, and I can't even get back in to get any of my stuff until I get work. What are you going to do? My uncle owns a restaurant in Scruton Lake, and he said I could come there and work for him. But I can't take Gary with me. Would you like us to keep him for a few days?
Catherine found herself facing the most difficult decision a mother could ever make.
Are you sure?
She had to earn a living to provide for her children, even if it meant being separated from them.
Looks like we're all set. Ready to go?
Daddy, Catherine wants to know if we can take in Gary for a few weeks. Is that okay?
Oh, for a few weeks, sure.
Several days later, Catherine left Lake Placid to take the job at her uncle's restaurant, secure in the knowledge that Gary would be well cared for by Florence and her family. Catherine's daughter, Gwen, who was 3 years old, went to live with Catherine's mother and father.
Come on, Gary, we need more.
3 years passed. Catherine visited whenever she could. Throughout this period, Gwen stayed with her grandparents, and Florence Winch took care of Gary.
Florence and my mom were great friends, and when my mother left my brother with Florence, I think she felt that it was a temporary thing and that she would get herself together and be able to support the family, you know. But it never really worked out that way. There were really difficult times.
Times were very hard, and Catherine was 2 hours away working, and she couldn't get there. It wasn't something that she didn't want to do. It was something that, a circumstance.
In 1939, when Gary was 3, county child welfare officials contacted Catherine. She signed papers which she thought would allow Florence to continue in the role of foster parent. In fact, the papers gave the county authorization to put Gary up for adoption.
When they told me that he was ready for adoption, I tried to adopt him. But I wasn't married at the time, and in those days you couldn't adopt a child unless you were married. So then my mother and father tried to adopt him. They were too old. There was an age limit at that time. So we had very good neighbors, and the neighbors took up a petition at that time and asked the county if I could keep him. And of course that was unheard of. So I couldn't keep him.
Finally, in the early spring of 1939, a county welfare worker informed Florence's family that Gary would be taken away for adoption. She gave them no idea when or where. Florence began to prepare Gary for the journey.
Look at the train, Gary. It's big, isn't it? This train goes all the road to New York.
When we would go by the railroad station to go to church or go to the store or anything, he was afraid of the train. I suppose because it made a noise. It was a steam engine. So in order that he wouldn't be afraid of it, I took him up to the train. The conductor saw us, and I was talking to Gary about the train, that it wouldn't hurt you. The conductor said, "Come on to the train." We went on to the train, and I sit in a seat with him. The train didn't go anywhere. I was sitting there. But I don't think he was afraid of the train after that.
Do you mind if we sit here a while?
I didn't talk to Gary at all about him leaving. I never told him that he might be going away. Now I could see maybe I should have, but at that time I didn't. I never told him that he was ever going to leave.
8 days after Gary's 4th birthday, the child welfare worker returned.
One morning at 9 o'clock, the social worker drove up and came into the house and said she was going to take him. I always thought that she wouldn't come, and that one way or the other we would keep him. Either Catherine or our family would keep him. But of course that didn't happen.
I've packed a few things for him. That won't be necessary.
And I said, well, could he take a toy? No, he couldn't. So with that, she just took him by the hand, and the car was down in front of the house, and she took him. I think now, as I look back on it, that Gary thought he was just going for a ride with somebody, that he was coming back. I don't think he ever thought he was going to leave. By
the time Florence was able to contact Catherine, it was too late. Gary had already been taken to New York City. Eventually, Catherine and her daughter Gwen were reunited, but in 1984, Catherine died. She never had a chance to tell Gary how much she loved him.
Well, I felt a real desire to find my brother in that I wanted to express to him how much guilt my mother had experienced through her life because of this loss, and to maybe be able to fill in some of the feelings that she had toward him and still carried onward even to her death. And I thought, well, I could give this to him on her behalf. I think it's about the last thing I can do for her.
Gary Bickford was born in Saranac Lake, New York on June 6, 1935. He has brown hair and brown eyes. On Gary's birth certificate, his first name was probably spelled with 2 R's, and his last name may have been listed as Rossman. When we return, the perplexing case of a missing millionaire. His family believes he was murdered. St. Croix, the U.S. Virgin Islands, a lush tropical getaway known as the American Paradise. In 1984, Jim Rice, a wealthy and successful contractor, came to the island of St. Croix with his wife Astarte to build their dream house and live the good life. But 2 years later, the marriage was crumbling.
Darlie, I wish you'd reconsider coming to San Francisco with me.
I've already told you I can't. I've already made plans.
In July 1986, Jim planned to fly to San Francisco for shoulder surgery. Astarte refused to accompany him, so Jim Rice was scheduled to make the trip alone. Now police believe he never made the trip at all.
To get an operation without his wife, which is more important?
My dad was scheduled to arrive on July 29th, and he never showed up at my house. Never called from the airport, or we just never heard from him again.
Jim Rice was a man's man. He played football in college and was a highly decorated bomber pilot during the Second World War. Through his construction business, Jim amassed a sizable fortune worth nearly $2 million. In 1970, Jim Rice met Astarte Davis and was instantly captivated. Jim turned his life upside down and left his first wife to marry Astarte. It proved to be a tumultuous union marked by business failures, separations, reconciliations, and finally Astarte's imprisonment in 1982 for bankruptcy fraud. Yet through it all, Jim Rice remained loyal to Astarte. Then, 3 years after Jim vanished, Astarte Rice also disappeared. She was born Estabel White, but as an adult changed her name to Astarte after a primitive goddess of love. She had 3 grown sons from a previous marriage which ended in divorce.
She seemed to make my dad happy, and I was happy for him. And I figured he saw something in her that I didn't see. And as long as he was happy, then that was okay.
In 1979, Jim and Astarte moved to Kona, Hawaii, and eventually started a charter fishing business. 2 years later, while Jim was out of town, Astarte's son Noble was cleaning their boat when it was rocked by an explosion. Noble was seriously injured but recovered. By good fortune or design, Astarte just happened to be near the dock at the time.
Well, there was a large debt on the yacht, and they carried insurance on the yacht. Noble indicated that he was just aboard cleaning the ship, which is kind of strange because it was like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. A strange time to be cleaning a boat using gasoline, and the yacht caught on fire, and he said it was just purely an accident. But there was sufficient cause for the authorities back there in Hawaii to charge both Astarte and Noble with the arson of the yacht.
After the explosion, Jim and Astarte separated. Both returned to California. Astarte and her son were never extradited back to Hawaii for trial. In April 1981, Astarte filed for bankruptcy. A year later, she was charged with altering official court documents. She was convicted and sent to federal prison. When Jim visited Astarte in prison, she convinced him that she had mended her ways, and they reconciled. After her release in 1983, Jim and Astarte moved to St. Croix in the Virgin Islands and built their dream house on an isolated bluff overlooking the Caribbean.
He got down to St. Croix and expected to build his dream house, and Astarte was going to go straight and not get in any trouble. And I think that he found out that she was not rehabilitated.
On July 20th, 1986, Jim phoned his daughter Kathy in the States and told her that he would be flying to California for shoulder surgery in a week. He never arrived.
Jim disappeared around the end of July 1986. Kathy kept trying to reach him by telephone and was totally unsuccessful for about 2 weeks. When she finally was able to reach his home in St. Croix, she talked to Astarte. And at that time, Astarte had told her that Jim had run off with a woman from Australia.
No, he went off fishing on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia.
A few days later, when she talked to Astarte, the story was that Jim had gone on an airplane and flown from St. Croix to Miami. So we had two completely different stories. And later on, Astarte denied that either of these things had occurred. So we know that right from the beginning, she lied about what had happened to Jim and how he disappeared.
2 months later, Kathy Clements hired Dennis Sharaw, a private investigator, to look into her father's disappearance.
I'm looking for a gentleman by the name of James Rice. He's a missing person.
Sharaw came across a customs declaration dated July 28, 1986, the day Jim was to leave for California. On the form, Jim Rice's signature appeared to have been forged. Sharaw notified the FBI.
I wonder if you'd do me a favor and hold this aside, and I'll have one of the agents from the FBI stop by and pick it up so they can process it.
We noted that Jim supposedly had flown on an airplane on July 28, 1986, from St. Croix to Miami. In fact, the airplane ticket had been bought by a person using the name of Jim Rice, and in fact, the people who actually flew on that flight were Astarte, Astarte's son Noble, and Noble's girlfriend.
Private investigator Dennis Sharaw also discovered that a week prior to Jim's scheduled flight to San Francisco, Astarte had filed documents which gave her control of Jim Rice's entire estate.
Do your thing with those.
From your husband too, Jim.
Yes.
Where is he?
We're meeting him in Miami very shortly, and that's one of the reasons we're in kind of a rush.
Probably the key document was a power of attorney in Astarte's name. Investigation, however, showed that this original power of attorney was in the name of Jim's daughter, Kathy Clements. And then Astarte had done a cut and paste job on the document and inserted her name in its place.
I hope to see you again.
I feel because Jim would have known that his assets were beginning to be changed or taken away from him, that Jim's disappearance had to happen in that 12-hour period, from the time that he last spoke to Kathy to the following morning when the documents were presented to the notaries.
Hi, ladies. Hi. I don't know if you had a chance to look at all the shirts and everything yet, but the jacket is really great.
Our investigation showed that just days after Jim's disappearance, all of his personal effects, his tools, his truck, were all sold in a garage sale that was conducted at the house and sold by Astarte and Noble Davis.
4 months later, Kathy Clements received a typewritten letter from Australia signed by Jim Rice. Once again, Jim's signature appeared to have been forged, and one other discrepancy cast doubt on the letter's authenticity.
The most important thing was the fact that the letter throughout contained the words "I am" put together. We know that from letters which we can attribute to Astarte that was a grammatical error that she frequently used.
I just thought that was the cruelest thing anybody could do. Would be to write a letter to a family of a missing person, posing as that person still being alive, giving an ounce of false hope. I just thought that was so cruel.
Kathy Clements and Dennis Sherrar are convinced that Jim Rice was murdered and that his body lay somewhere beneath the blue waters of the Caribbean, and that Astarte Rice may hold the key to solving the mystery. In January 1989, Astarte Rice was charged with bank and mail fraud because of her attempt to seize Jim Rice's assets. She was released on bail and disappeared. In 1991, Astarte Davis Rice was arrested in Santa Barbara, California. Because Jim Rice's body had never been found, authorities were unable to charge her in his death, though the FBI still considers her a prime suspect. Astarte did, however, plead guilty to bank and passport fraud in the United States and in St. Croix, and served the first portion of her 15-year sentence in a medium-security prison in California. In 1997, Astarte was transferred to the minimum security federal prison camp in Dublin, California to complete the rest of her term. A year later, taking advantage of the lighter security, Astarte Davis Rice simply walked out of the facility.
She was present during the morning count at approximately between 5 and 6 a.m. Then during the course of the day, there was a fire drill conducted, which resulted in another prison count being conducted at 10 a.m. She wasn't scheduled to work that day, and so it was the time frame between the first count and the second count that she had the opportunity to leave the facility. She's very cunning, she's smart, she's intelligent, and she's very dangerous. She'll use anyone to deplete their resources, and she's been suspected of being involved in the disappearance of people.
For every mystery, there is someone, somewhere, who knows the truth. Perhaps it's you.